Tonight, I have the great honor of introducing Mr. Jared Fishman. Mr. Fishman earned his bachelor's degree from the University of Pennsylvania and his law degree from George Washington University Law School. He began his career at the U.S. State Department, where he worked to rebuild legal system in post-war Kosovo. He also served as a line prosecutor at the Washington, D.C. U.S. Attorney's Office, where he handled domestic violence and sex crimes cases. Mr. Fishman is the founder and executive director of Justice Innovation Lab, an organization that uses a collaborative, data-informed approach to help identify and fix harmful outcomes in justice systems across the United States. Prior to founding the Justice Innovation Lab, he served for 14 years as a federal prosecutor in the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Department. He led some of the most complex civil rights prosecution in the country, securing convictions in high-profile cases involving police misconduct, hate crimes, and human trafficking. Mr. Fishman is the author of Fire on the Levee, The Murder of Henry Glover, and The Search for Justice after Hurricane Katrina. Fire on the Levee tells the behind-the-scenes story of the mysterious murder and burning of a black man after Hurricane Katrina. Jared led the investigation that resulted in the prosecution of 5 New Orleans Police Department officers. He serves as adjunct faculty at the George Washington University Law School and Georgetown University. His work and analysis have been featured on major TV networks and newspapers in the United States. And in his spare time, he loves swimming, tennis, cross-country, skiing, and hockey. He's also the lead singer and rhythm guitarist in a middle-aged dad band. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Fishman.
Thank you. Thank you, bishops. I'm gonna let you in on a little bit of secret. I've always dreamed of performing in Lennoxville. No, it's true. I just thought it would be with my middle-aged dad band over at the Lion, but this will do. This is my first large in-person event since COVID, and the first speech that I'm doing on my book tour. And my colleague said, "You really want to take on an auditorium that big for your first time out?" And I said, "Listen, they're Canadian, and even if I fail miserably, I can count on them to at least applaud politely." So thank you for that. My speech tonight is, what does it mean to do justice? And it's a question that I have spent most of my career trying to answer. I worked at the U.S. Department of Justice, and one of my responsibilities was to investigate allegations of police brutality and investigate killings by police officers. My office was responsible for policing the police. In December 2017, I stood on the court steps in Charleston, South Carolina, after what was arguably the biggest victory of my career. A North Charleston Police Department officer had been convicted and sentenced to 20 years in prison, one of the longest sentences ever given to a police officer for the killing of an unarmed black man. The newspaper declared it a monumental day for civil rights. Walter Scott's brother, Anthony Scott, said, "Not only did we get justice today, but the truth was told." It was precisely the kind of victory that I had always dreamed of winning. And yet, as I stood on the courthouse steps that day, I felt empty. I felt empty because I knew no matter what, Walter wasn't coming back. I knew that in the 2.5 years it had taken me to investigate and prosecute that case, over 2,500 other people had been killed in confrontations with the police. And I knew that the next day, the structures and policies and systems that contributed to Walter's death were still going to be in place. So sure, by one metric, years of incarceration, we had won an overwhelming victory. But had we done justice? That was a question I was far less certain of. Now, after 20 years of working inside America's justice system, I've come to realize our system isn't actually built to achieve justice. Our system was designed to achieve punishment. And one thing that I've learned after sending many people to prison for doing terrible things to other people is that we should never confuse punishment for justice. But it's also important to remember that this system, it was built by people. And we can decide whether or not we want to build something different. So how did I get here? I grew up in a homogenous Jewish community in Atlanta, Georgia. My grandparents had escaped Nazi Germany and settled in the US. I grew up hearing over and over again, never again. Never again could we let such terrible things happen to other people. In my childhood, it was the Jewish concept of tikkun olam that I think most resonated with me. It's a social justice concept that says the world is broken, and we all have an obligation to try to fix it. Now, I took that obligation pretty seriously. So seriously, in fact, that I sought out the most broken places in the world. Places that had recently experienced war and genocide. Places like Rwanda, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Kosovo, the Middle East. For me, working in these places, I thought, how do we fix what's been destroyed? And I thought that we should probably start by working on the systems of law and justice that keep our society safe. But I learned that's easier said than done. My first job out of law school, I worked for the U.S. Department of State, U.S. government's foreign affairs arm, where I worked with police and prosecutors and courts as people were trying to rebuild their justice systems. One of my biggest takeaways from that time period is that it's really easy to destroy. It is a lot more difficult to build something better. One day I was working in Kosovo, driving through a frozen countryside on my way to meet a police commander. And I was discussing with a senior colleague who was himself a prosecutor what we needed to do to change the system. How could we build something better? And he looked at me and he said, "Kid," well, he didn't actually say that, but I feel like the story works a little bit better. But he looks at me and he says, "Kid, you're smart. You've done well in school. You've done well in law school. You have good ideas, but you haven't experienced the world yet. And if you want to work on changing our system, you need to go work inside the system first." He looked at me and he told me that I should be a prosecutor. Now, for those of you who have been sitting here patiently wondering what exactly a prosecutor is and who have managed to get this far in life without ever watching an episode of Law & Order, let me tell you this. In the criminal justice system, the people are represented by two separate yet equally important groups: the police, who investigate crimes, and the district attorneys, who prosecute the offenders. These are their stories. Dum-dum. Now, what they're called varies from state to state. In some places, they're called district attorneys. In some places, state's attorneys or solicitors. But something important to know is that prosecutors sit smack in the middle of the justice system. They're the connectors between the police and the court system. They are the people who choose what charges a person face. They're the ones who stand up in court and ask for convicted people to go to prison. Now, as I rode through that frozen countryside in Kosovo, I couldn't fathom being a prosecutor. I couldn't imagine locking people up. So I told my colleague, well, if I'm going to work in the system, I'm going to be a defense attorney. I care too much about civil rights. My colleague looked at me with that serious look in his face, and he says, if you care about civil rights, then you should definitely be a prosecutor, because they're the ones with all the power. Now, prosecutors' decisions have the power to impact who is arrested and what happens to him afterwards. Their decisions dictate who goes to prison and for how long. In a single year, a prosecutor can impact the lives of hundreds, if not thousands, of people. It is a remarkable amount of power to invest in any single human being. But I was convinced, because I cared about civil rights, and the prosecutors had all the power. And so I began my unexpected career as a prosecutor. I took a year-long position in Washington, D.C., where I handled misdemeanor domestic violence cases and sex crimes. And much to my surprise, I loved the job. I love the pace of being in court. I love the drama of criminal trials. I liked knowing that I was on a mission to do justice, even though no one actually told me what that meant. But being a prosecutor in the American criminal justice system gave me a front row seat to what is wrong with our system. It was impossible to notice that most of the people entering our courthouse every day were black or brown. I saw an inordinate amount of poverty, and I saw some of the most marginalized people in our society. The volume of these cases coming at me every day was overwhelming. And I, as a rookie prosecutor, was making hundreds of decisions with very little information. I was the one making decisions about who went to jail and for how long. I was the one making decisions about whether or not someone would get an alternative to prosecution, like counseling or drug treatment. I was the one who got to make a decision about whether or not someone got a free pass. Like I said, it's a remarkable amount of power to vest in one individual. And even as I made those decisions that were impacting scores of lives, rarely did I ever learn whether or not I'd made a good or a bad decision. Every day was like drinking out of a fire hose. I'd react to what was thrown to me. I'd make the best decision I could with the limited information I had, and I hoped that I was doing justice. There was one day near the end of my time there where I had a domestic violence case, and the victim came to me right before we were to go in and try that case. And she looks at me and she says, "Mr. Fishman, what happens if we win? What, is he going to get 15 days in jail?" I said, "Yeah, that sounds about right." And she looks at me and she says, "Mr. Fishman, where are you going to be in 15 days? I walked into that courtroom and I told her, I said, "Listen, I'm going to go in that courtroom, I'm going to call out the case, and if you're in there, we'll go ahead and prosecute it. And if you're not there, the case will be dismissed and your boyfriend will go free." I walked into that courtroom, I called out that case, and I heard nothing, and the case was dismissed. Now, the end result certainly did not feel like justice, but it's important to remember it's hard to get justice in a system that's built for punishment. So I thought to myself, if I want to do justice, maybe I should do a different kind of prosecution. Maybe I should use the power of that office to prosecute people who exploit and abuse the most vulnerable people in our justice system. And I started working at the Department of Justice in the Civil Rights Division. My job was to enforce America's civil rights laws. I traveled across America prosecuting hate crimes and human trafficking. But the cases that I spent the most time on were the police misconduct cases. And this is when I came to understand that every year in America, over 1,000 people are killed in confrontations with the police. That's 1 in 20 of all homicides in the US. And that number is even crazier when you realize that about 75% of homicides are committed where the offender knows the victim. It's about 1 in 3 of stranger homicides are committed by the police. How is that possible? And I wanted to be the one to hold the police accountable. I wanted to be the one to fight back when the community was harmed. I wanted to go get the bad cops. And then there was the case that upended almost everything I know about the justice system. It's perhaps the most revelatory example of how a system built solely to punish fails to get us the justice that we need. And I write about it in my book, Fire on the Levee. It's coming out in April. Pre-order now. Definitely buy like 5. Buy it for your friends. There's also going to be an opportunity to sign up at the end to win a free copy. There's 40 copies available for Bishop students. Now, the case started out as a mystery. In 2005, days after Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans, a man named Henry Glover seemingly disappeared. Now, it's important to remember that at this time, after Hurricane Katrina, the people left in the city could mostly be split into 2 groups: the poorest of the mostly black population and the police. Now, after Henry Glover's disappeared, his family had little idea of what happened to him until his body was found burned behind a levee. For years, no one had any idea what happened to him. And then an investigative journalist wrote an article laying what little was known about Henry's last day. What was important to know was that Henry's body was last seen in the custody of the New Orleans Police Department. In 2009, almost 4 years after Henry's death, the Department of Justice sent a much younger version of me down to New Orleans to try to figure out what happened and to see whether or not the police actually had anything to do with this. For the next 15 months, working with a rookie FBI agent and a sorted cast of motley characters in New Orleans and Washington, D.C., we tried to unravel what happened. There were twists and turns every step of the way, partly because along the way, everyone was lying to us. And we struggled to figure out what exactly the police were trying to cover up. Now, I'm not going to ruin the ending because, no, seriously, I really need you guys to buy the book. But I will say this. Our investigation implicated the police at all levels of the department and led to charges against multiple police officers for their role in killing Henry Glover, burning his body, and covering up that crime. Now, there were a lot of things that were unusual about this case. There was the dystopian hellscape of a society on the brink of collapse after a natural disaster of unprecedented dimensions. There was a police force notorious as one of the most abusive and corrupt in the United States. And there were colorful characters that you can only find in New Orleans. But one thing that really stuck with me during this investigation was how many of the people inside the system saw wrongdoing and did nothing about it, or lied about it, or helped cover up for it. I mean, the number of people that lied to me during the course of that 15-month investigation is pretty unprecedented. When I wrote the first draft of the manuscript, it was about 200 pages longer. And my editor said, listen, you're going to need to cut that down. It's a lot of pages for people to read. You should probably get rid of all the people lying to you. I said, well, I mean, really, there was like a lot of people who lied to us. And we did. We cut it down. It's 200 pages shorter now. But one thing to remember is that's what happens in a system built solely for punishment. People lie. They lie a lot. And they lie because they don't want to be punished, and they don't want their friends to be punished. In this case, the officers feared being punished by me. I had the authority to indict people and charge them with crimes that could send them to prison. Like I said, it's a lot of power to be vested in one individual. But they were also legitimately afraid of being punished by the police themselves. Police were afraid of being murdered for telling the truth, or at the very least, that if they responded to a call, they wouldn't get the backup that they needed. The case was illustrative about what is broken in the American justice system, and I hope this book can also help illuminate how we began to fix it. Because for years after the Henry Glover case, and with every killing by the police that I prosecuted, and perhaps even more importantly, all of the ones that I could not prosecute, I realized that something much bigger was happening. This wasn't just a case of bad apples. This is a system problem, and putting a few individual officers in prison wasn't going to solve that problem. And so this was the realization that came crashing down on me on the courthouse steps in Charleston, South Carolina, in the wake of Walter Scott's murder. And I had to wonder, what would it look like to do things differently? What would it look like if we built a system that was actually designed for accountability instead of punishment? Now, the analogy that kept coming to my mind is a plane crash. What if we treated every in-custody death like a plane crash? Now, what do I mean by in-custody death? I mean people who die at the hands of law enforcement or in the custody of law enforcement, and that's more than just police shootings or police beatings. That's people who die in prison or jail or otherwise in the custody of the state. What if we treated those in-custody deaths like a plane crash? What if we collectively decided, like they have in commercial aviation, that it is not okay for even a single person to die on our watch? After a plane crash, we review all of the decisions that were made, big and small, that contributed to to the crash, not just the actions of the pilot. And the goal of one of these investigations is to do things differently so it doesn't happen again, so we can learn from the mistakes that came before us. And as a result of that approach, we haven't had a single commercial airlines crash in North America in over 20 years. What would it look like if we treated every in-custody death like a plane crash? What if we looked at all of those decisions before the decision to pull the trigger? What if we saw these deaths as symptoms of a bigger problem shaped by policy and culture and systems? What if we wanted to make sure that these incidents never happened again? These were the kind of questions running through my mind when I got a phone call from solicitor Scarlett Wilson. Scarlett, as she is known by everyone down in Charleston, the city where Walter Scott had been murdered. I got to know Scarlett during the investigation and prosecution of the Walter Scott murder. Now, Scarlett and I are a bit of an odd couple. She is an elected Republican law and order prosecutor, and I am her lefty civil rights friend. But notwithstanding our differences, we had started a similar journey. Like me, she had a growing understanding that our legal system was marred with bias, and she wanted to know whether or not this bias was affecting her office's work. One day she told me she had been collecting data on all of these important decisions made by prosecutors in her office, from who got charged to what did they get charged with, to how were they incarcerated, what happened. And she said, I got all of this data and I don't know what to do with it. Do you think we can use this data to figure out? Are we being fair? Now, no one I had ever come across with had asked this question. And not only had they asked this question, but have the data to try to begin to explore and answer that question. Are we being fair? Now, at the time that Scarlett called me up, I did not know much about data. I had read Moneyball. Anyone here read Moneyball? Great book. After you buy Fire on the Levee and you read it and you share it with your friends, buy Moneyball. For those of you who haven't read it, Moneyball tells the story of a mid-market baseball team who uses data analytics to start winning baseball games. And I figured if the Oakland A's can use data analytics to go to the World Series, surely we could use it to reduce incarceration in America. Now, to be clear, reading Moneyball does not make one an expert in data analytics. So I began putting together the kind of team that we needed to tackle the problems. But first I had to figure out whether or not this could really work. So I tried to find someone who knew something about data, and I reached out to my old alma mater, and I said, can you find someone who knows something about data? And I got passed around a bunch until eventually I got linked up with a great guy named Don Brayman, who, in addition to sharing my love for justice, is also a big fan of the Eastern Townships, and happened to be here tonight. So, to Don Brayman, he's in the audience, all right? And Don and I began putting together a team of data scientists and data engineers, former law enforcement, lawyers, people with specialties in adult learning, organizational culture, and storytelling. Because it became clear to me that if we were going to take on the entrenched injustices of the system, we were going to need a lot of skills. A lot of skills that typically don't come together to try to solve these problems. But first, I'll admit, I needed to learn a little bit more about data. Now, do we have any history majors in the house? Yeah? Any math haters? Yeah? Any people who are going into law because you don't really like math? Yeah? I was there once. I understand. So what I want to do as part of tonight is to demystify data, because this is really all you need to know. Data equals counting. That's all we're doing when we talk about using data. But there's two things that you need to know about using a data-informed approach. It is only valuable if we're using reliable information, And it only matters if we're counting the right things. So let me give you an example about counting the wrong things. First time I had learned about data and metrics was when I worked at the State Department. Now, at that point, the US was responding to the sort of aftermath of a war in Iraq that was really an ongoing war in Iraq. And our goal was to try to reestablish the rule of law. Now, George W. Bush had been in the private sector for a really long time, and he wanted to bring some of these corporate ideas to government, and one of the things he brought was metrics. And so we were going to count how much rule of law we were establishing in Iraq. Well, my favorite metric that we were using was the number of courthouses that we had built. Now, as I can tell from the laughter and the scoffing in the audience, that yes, that is a terrible metric, because I think we can all agree that courthouses do not equal justice. Now, traditionally in the American justice system, we have used one metric for quantifying justice, and that's years of incarceration. And when you are a prosecutor, that metric is often used to judge whether or not you are successful. But as I'm sure you can tell at this point in my speech, I agree that that's about as useful of a metric as the number of courthouses built. Incarceration does not equal justice. So, what if we measured different things? Now, this is the part of the speech where I look to the audience for inspiration about what should we count? What would you count if you were trying to figure out if your justice system was fair? All right, now, in an American audience, all 300 of you will have already yelled something out. But I get this. I got to adapt for the cultural norms. Just yell it out. What's something you'd want to count to figure out? Crime rates, recidivism, economics. All right. All great things that we can count. I mean, what if we treated the justice system like a Yelp review and we asked people how they felt about how we were doing? I mean, we could count anything. Because when we do ask victims of crime how they feel about the justice system, 7 in 10 say they would rather prosecutors focus on solving neighborhood problems and stopping repeat crimes through rehabilitation, even if that meant that we sent fewer people to prison for so long. I mean, it's something important to realize, and most prosecutors know this. We get in this work because we want to fight on behalf of victims of crime. But the reality is over half of people who are victimized don't even use our system. They opt out, choosing not to report their crimes to the police. What if we built a system that truly cared about restoring victims as much as we could? All right? What if what we cared about was how many of our murders we were solving? Because over the same time period that America's incarceration rates have skyrocketed, our ability to solve homicides have dropped dramatically. How can we call it a justice system if we can't solve 1 in 2 murders? Recidivism. What if we counted how many people came into our system and then never came back again? What if that was what mattered? And what if they never came back because we were treating the poverty or mental health crises or addiction issues that people were facing, and we got them the services that they need so that they never came back? Now, Scarlett wanted to know, are we being fair? I wanted to count whether or not black and white people were getting different outcomes for similar conduct. I wanted to count the number of total years of incarceration that they were sending people to prison for every single year. And I wanted to count things like how many cases were being thrown out of the system for insufficient evidence. Because I wanted to know how many cases were in the system that really had no business being there in the first place. I wanted to count these things because to me, I thought they were instructive metrics about whether or not we were being fair, about whether or not we were being effective. Now, they're not the only things we can and should count, but to me, they're a good starting point to this question of whether or not we're doing justice. Now, in order for you to understand how this plays out, I want you to understand a few basic things about the American criminal justice system. Now, first, when we talk about the criminal justice system, we often speak of it in the singular, as if it were a singular thing. But actually, America's justice system is more like 2,300 different justice systems that each exist at the local level, usually at the city or the county. They're usually run by elected officials, judges and prosecutors who get elected. And these local systems handle about 95% of all criminal cases in America. And it's also important to note that each of these systems function relatively independently. Now, the second thing that is important to know is that the vast majority of cases entering the American justice system are not for violent crimes, as fans of Law and Order may be forgiven for thinking, but rather it's mostly filled of low-level offenses like drug possession, shoplifting, low-level assaults. Every year, American police arrest about 10 million folks, mostly for low-level offenses like counterfeit bills, which prompted the incident involving George Floyd, or selling loose cigarettes that led to the death of Eric Garner. They often begin with traffic stops, often for minor infractions, like the one that led to the death of Walter Scott in Philando Castile. To get closer to something that resembles justice, we need to build a system that is accountable to itself. Now, how do we do that? To me, it starts by asking a few basic questions that, much to my surprise, people ask very rarely. Why do we even have this system in the first place? What do we collectively think is important? And are we actually spending our time and money on the things that we care the most about? So with that in mind, we began to interview prosecutors in the places that we work, and we asked them to rank their priorities. We took in Charleston, South Carolina, the top 50 charges entering the system that they were dealing with, which collectively accounts for almost 99% of all the cases that they see. And we asked them to rank them in order. And because I've got a really smart data team that can build all these cool apps, all the prosecutors would get 5 crimes at a time. They would then rank them. And not surprisingly, when they did that, the things that you would expect people to care the most about ranked at the top. Things like murder, sexual assault, armed carjackings. These were the things that prosecutors prioritize as being important for their public safety. I know you can't read this. I've been told it's a terrible graphic. I'm working on it. I couldn't get it ready. It's going to be fine for the tour, but just work with me today. On the left, this is the ranking, with the things that they care the most about at the top, the things that they care the least about at the bottom. And on the right-hand side, we decided that we were going to tell them how are they actually spending their time. This was paradigm shifting for many prosecutors. Now, one thing to note when you look at these numbers and they kind of blow your mind, this is in a city of 600,000 people over the course of only 5 years. This is what we are spending our time on. This is what we are spending our money on. Now, not only are a lot of the cases in our system low priority cases, but they're also low quality, low priority cases. And one of the things that we found as we started looking in the data was that 1 in 4 of the cases that were entering the system were going to be dismissed in their entirety using what we call an early opportunity dismissal code. But what does that mean? Those are things like insufficient evidence, failure to meet the elements, the failure to have the evidence to move forward. 1 in 4, 25%. Now, that's bad enough from a resource waste allocation. And most of the prosecutors agreed that these cases had no business being in the system. That's why they dismissed them. It's bad enough. But it was taking them, on average, 221 days to realize this. Now, what happens during those 221 days? Some people are detained. Almost all of them have to pay cash bonds in order to gain their freedom. Many people lose their jobs. The costs in lost wages, social and family costs, and liberty is incalculable. And the people who were impacted were overwhelmingly black. Because as bad as the 221-day disparity was, black defendants were waiting 67 days longer, on average, than a similarly situated white defendant. We measured the things that mattered, and the office did not like what they saw. Now, what we've seen in plenty of places, when you throw numbers at folks, they tend to get defensive and they tend to fight with you. No one wants to be called a racist, I can tell you that. But by working with this office to actually answer the questions that they wanted to know, by the metrics that they believed would show whether or not they were being fair, they saw something that they didn't like, and they committed to fixing it. Now, how do we fix this? How do we begin to get a system that is accountable to itself? Now, for a Canadian audience, I feel like I can tell this story. Over the course of COVID, I really got into cross-country skiing. I found like you couldn't hang out with anyone, but at least we got the woods and the snow, and I loved the skis. And my mother-in-law, she had given me these great pairs of skis, really fast racers 20 years ago when I married my wife. And we were out there skiing all the time, except for there was this one downhill portion of the trail that we liked. That was really steep with a tight turn. And every single time I did that run, I wiped out miserably. And for those of you of middle age, you can appreciate this. It gets harder and harder to wipe out every single time. So before the next season, my wife comes to me and she says, "Honey," and when she does it in that voice, the honey, you know I'm about to get some unsolicited advice. But she says, we need to take a lesson. And I love that she said we, because it was this communal effort. And we take a cross-country ski lesson, and the instructor looks at me and he says, "No, you know what you're doing. It's just your skis are 20 years old. You need some new skis, man." And that is often our reality. We're experiencing these problems and we don't even realize that we have the wrong tools. And so we decided that we needed to give this office better tools. We wanted to build the tools that would help them get the junk out of their system. And to figure this out, we turned to a discipline that some of you may know of, known as systems thinking. This is the type of thinking that's been used for engineers for decades. It's an approach that they turn to fix pervasive and complex problems. Now, we often talk about systemic racism, and yet I never hear anyone talking about systems thinking. But one of the things that I've realized as we have gone out and talked about how do you fix a system is that this, in many ways, gives us the language and the words to help move our system forward. So, what are some of the things that you need to know? A system is not the sum of its parts. It's the product of its interactions. And it's also important to know that systems are perfectly designed to achieve the results they are currently achieving. So if you want to achieve different results, then you have to improve the interactions between the component parts. And so we decided to try an experiment. And like all good scientific experiments, we started with a hypothesis. We believed that we could build a process that more quickly and fairly identified cases to have them removed from the system. We helped the office set up a pilot program where an experienced prosecutor reviewed a subset of cases from a single police department. We changed how their system functioned with that goal in mind, remove bad cases from the system. Remarkably, this was not at all controversial. And what happened? We saw the case dismissal rate jump. And not only that, they were dismissing these cases far faster. Over a quarter of the cases they could dismiss in under 1 day. Now, that was good because it had a lot of positive outcomes for that office. Number one, it meant that people who should not be in the system are quickly removed, reducing the harmful impacts of being in the system. It freed up time for police and prosecutors. Some estimated as much as has the potential to free up the time of 2 whole prosecutors in their office so that they can more focus on the serious crimes and better serve victims. And if done properly, it creates a feedback loop between prosecutors and the police that can change how we police our communities and lead to smarter enforcement. But it also began addressing some very real racial disparities that we saw in the system created by bad policing. We saw for black defendants, their dismissal rates jumped significantly, which to us indicated that prosecutors were identifying these cases that shouldn't have been there in the first place. That lower income black individuals in this community were being arrested at disproportionate rates. And this process began to remove them from the system faster. Much to my surprise, police chiefs have been very supportive of our work on these kind of changes. The Charleston's leading newspaper called it a common sense, "We can't believe this isn't being done" program. Now, I can tell you why it isn't already happening. Because it's harder to build than to destroy. The status quo and inertia are pretty powerful adversaries. But at Justice Innovation Lab, the organization that I founded, we're committed to doing this kind of building. It's not easy, it's not fast, and there's a lot more upfront costs. But over the long term, it's going to help communities reprioritize their spending so their money goes to doing the things that they actually want to do. And because of the success of the pilot, starting next month, we're expanding this program to review more cases from every single police department in the Charleston County area. This will drastically reduce the number of cases in the system, and it will drastically reduce incarceration. Now, the most innovative thing that I think we do at Justice Innovation Lab, and I will even dare to call it radical, is that we meet communities where they're at. This is the key to our success, and I think a skill that far too few people, particularly lawyers, seem to develop: empathy. We do a lot of interactive programs with offices where we work them through how we understand the program and how we got here, and understanding how some of these systems got in place. And one of the exercises that we do, we call deconstructing racial narratives. We give prosecutors photographs, disturbing photographs from America's racialized history. Pictures of lynchings, pictures of 8-year-old kids on a chain gang, pictures of a black man being spat at for trying to integrate a Woolworths counter. And we asked those prosecutors, what stories had to be told for this picture to have existed? People recognized that, well, we had to tell a story of dehumanization. We had to tell a story that maybe black people are more criminal. We had to tell a story that their lives were devalued. We then talk about some of the legal structures that were put in place, like the 13th Amendment that created a loophole that said, yeah, we're going to abolish slavery, but we're going to keep it in place if you get duly convicted of a crime. A lot of people don't know about the 13th Amendment's loophole. But what did we see immediately after the 13th Amendment? A lot of laws being passed that were race neutral on their face, but almost uniformly enforced against black folks, who were then leased back out to some of the very same plantations or corporations. And these systems and structures that were built in the aftermath of slavery, they have stayed with us. And so one of the questions we ask prosecutors is, what racial narratives could explain this 67-day disparity and how long it's taking you to dismiss a case for black folks than for white folks? And there was this one prosecutor, a law and order type, a tough guy. And he raises his hand as if it hits him for the very first time, and he says, maybe I'm keeping these cases open longer because I inherently think that black people are more dangerous. And he says this in front of a group of every single prosecutor in that community. Over the next month, we saw cases getting removed from the system right and left. A spike of people saying, you know what, I am not going to stand for that anymore. And now that same prosecutor is helping us lead the building of the procedures and processes that will take on this implicit bias head on. When we meet people where they're at, when we engage in empathetic conversations, we can motivate them to take the necessary action to change the structures, the policies, and the procedures. Because changing systems requires changing relationships. And if we are going to change these systems, we must build bigger alliances and healthier collaboration. At Justice Innovation Lab, we like to say, it starts by understanding the world as it is, imagining the world as it could be, and then do something about it. There is a different way forward. We can redesign our system so that its purpose is accountability and so that it aligns with our values. It's not easy, and it is not fast. But one thing I have learned since starting Justice Innovation Lab is that it is entirely doable. It requires us to ask better questions. It requires us to count the right things. It requires us to use different methods of thinking. And it requires us to have a more inclusive sense of community. And it requires that when we see injustice, we do something about it. Now, you're probably asking at this point, what can I do? How can I help? First, we are all part of systems. What systems are you a part of? And are your systems achieving outcomes that are consistent with your values, that you can be proud of? And if they're not, why are they not? What are those relationships that you can strengthen that will move us closer to justice? Innovate those systems. I'll give you a tip about what I've learned about innovation over the last few years. All it takes is taking someone else's good idea and bringing it to a new context. And there are a lot of good ideas out there. Someone else has already solved your problem. Go find them. Now, second, if we're going to change the world, we have to recognize that the worldviews that we bring to the table are inherently limited. We all have blind spots. For all of the power of the human mind, it is still definitely fallible. So expand your communities. Expand your perspectives. Go talk to people who are different from you. Meet them where they are at. Because when you do, you will see new ways that you can make a difference in your communities and in your systems. Whoops. Follow us. Join the Justice Innovation Lab community. Learn about our work. We regularly post about some of the most innovative projects, not only the stuff that we're doing, but the people who inspire us. Because we need to find these solutions, and we need to bring them to more people. And while you're on our website, if you feel inclined to hit the donate button, my development people said I had to mention this. I'm like, I don't know, it feels a little uncomfortable. But this stuff costs money. And if we are going to continue doing work like we're doing in Charleston, we're slated to move in Memphis to help them build new systems. We're doing work in Savannah, Georgia, and St. Paul, Minnesota. We're taking on more jurisdictions because as more and more communities hear about our work, they want us there. Buy the book? Seriously? My publisher said I had to say it at least 3 times. But we are developing a guide for how you can lead community conversations about these difficult conversations about policing, about fairness in our communities, to help motivate people to find answers, Because one thing I can tell you is I certainly haven't figured out all the answers, and I won't do it by myself. We need more and more people dedicated to solving these problems. Now, our criminal justice system is a result of choices made by many, many individuals over a long period of time. And some of these structures and practices were deliberately built to oppress others. Sometimes they're merely unintended consequences. As Martin Luther King Jr. once noted, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. But it's important to remember, it does not bend on its own. Doing justice, bending that moral arc, it requires the dedication and commitment to build something better. I refuse to accept that the current system is the best that we can do. People created these problems, and people can fix them. And so if each of us can do what is within our power to improve the world and the systems around us, even just a little, then collectively we will move closer to that elusive ideal of justice. Thank you.